Next up, we have a visitor all the way from Toronto, Canada, Furkan Usumcu, who has started and now drives a rather interesting project to try and capture some best practices around QML, which I think is very commendable. He'll tell us all about it. Please welcome Furkan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. I'm very excited to be here. My resting heart rate is usually 60. I don't know if you know him, but Ulf is here. I'm freaking out right now. His work is awesome. Right now, it's like I'm running at 120. It's good to be here. And in case you need a reason to submit a talk proposal here, they give you a makeup. If you haven't seen me before, I could have been Shrek. They did a good work on me. My name is Furkan. I started using QML about 6 years ago now, maybe 6, 7. I love building keyboards. I love open source. I used to contribute to KDE as well. Maybe that's why the previous speaker seemed familiar to me. I've been doing UI work for a while. I love UIs. I love thinking about it, building good, fluid user interfaces, and the code behind it as well. And for the past 3 years, I've been working at Autodesk with wonderful developers and designers. I don't think I need to, so my talk is GuideQML guidelines, and I don't think I need to convince anybody here that guidelines are good. But before I move on, by show of hands, can you tell how many of you are doing QML work daily or maybe a few times a week? Okay, how many of you started as a person who uses C++ or any other imperative languages? Almost all the same hands. How about HTML? Do you come from an HTML background? Okay, 3, 4 people. And how about embedded? Any embedded developers? I assume most of you are. Oh, not as many. Desktop? Good. I'm a desktop developer too. I think this will be more relevant too. And how about web? Okay. So there's a reason why I did that poll. I'll explain in a bit. But guidelines are useful, especially for a new language like QML that doesn't really have that much of a audience like other languages. It's especially in the case of QML where it's being used in like extreme cases where you have desktop with lots of power and you have embedded, the opposite of that. So the experience that you have in the platforms that you're working on is going to affect how you use the language. But thankfully, like the way they developed it, you can use them in both extreme cases. And since also being a new language and a language with a different paradigm than the one that you're used to using every day. You come from C++, a dominantly imperative language, to something like QML, where it's supposed to be dominantly declarative style. So there's a bit of a paradigm shift there that's, in my experience with the people I've worked with, it's very different, even like me personally, it was different from going from that, 1, 2, 3, 4, you start from top to bottom and then everything is done, to just looking at the code, establishing that relationship. It's a bit of a mind shift, and that really slows you down, especially when you start using QML. And the other reason why guidelines are good is because of tooling. Now, there's lots of work happening in tooling in the Qt world with compiler and the formatting and the linting and various others. It's good to have some sort of industry experience that can be implemented back into those tools so that they can warn me about the issues that you had, but I never run into and I'm about to make the same mistake. So while working on QML myself, I realized that I started doing certain things and a pattern emerged and I started writing these down. And you might ask, there's already existing guidelines. Qt documentation has it. Nokia has some guidelines. I believe there's some from BlackBerry, and ICS has it too. There's also other blog posts and then videos that you can see. But all of that information is very scattered. In the case of Nokia ones and BlackBerry ones, they're outdated, and especially these days, QML and the tooling behind it is moving very fast. So you need to adapt to it. And as I was adopting, going through my struggles using QML, I started noting some things down, unstructured at first, and then it turned into something more structured along the way, and that's how the coding guidelines are. It says community-driven, but at first I was driving that most of the time. So most of these things, especially the code style part that I'm going to talk about in a bit, is my personal preference. It's the pattern that emerged from the way that I write code that may be different for you. All right, so what are guidelines? Guidelines, what are they not? I think this is important, especially now you may, as I talk about certain things, you'll say, oh, I've been doing it this way, why should I change, right? And you don't need to. Guidelines are supposed to be kind of like a guiding light for you, so you don't need to strictly abide by them. It's not a holy book. It's okay to break it from now and then. You just need to discuss it with your team, see that emerging patterns in your code base and document it so that the newcomers to your code base understands the rules and they can adjust to it rather than them also writing code to their liking and then come up with their own versions of what QML code looks like. But I think it's important to understand what guidelines are not, but what guidelines are for more important than what they're not. And what they're for is making code and your code base easier to read, write, understand, and maintain. If your guidelines are not supporting these principles, then I think guidelines are just probably some selfish attempt at imposing your will on others, so there's no point to it. And guidelines are also good in the case of tooling, especially if it gets implemented back to something like QML lint. I heard that it's supposed to have some sort of way for you to implement your own checkers into it, so it's definitely useful. Because in the case of desktop, for most of us, I'm not going to care if I do something 3 times because I have enough power, but for someone embedded, maybe that's a holy sin. And since you'll have newcomers to your project, those new people will also benefit from this so that they don't make the same mistakes and then learn those mistakes along the way. Because not all of the things that we talk about usually can be caught at code review time. Some of the things will be missed, and that's when the tooling and these guidelines come in. Before I move into the guidelines, I want to go through my thought process of how I read QML code. And reading QML code begins before you even see the code. Once you look at the file, there's a file name, and in the example here, it says circle mouse area. Now, that name itself gives me an idea of what to expect from that file, what to expect from that interface. In the case here, it makes me think, it's circle and mouse area. I know what mouse area is. I know what circle is. Maybe this is going to be a circle mouse area. Very simple example. And since I'm a new user, and I'm expecting from the name that it's a mouse area, maybe there's going to be some signals in it, so I'm already building a mental model of what it's supposed to look like. So I go from the top, reading that code, and first thing I hit is the item part, the base type that I'm using. And at this point, I'm already building knowledge. I'm like, okay, this is an item. Now I know about the properties that it has, the signal that it has, and the basic interaction that it's going to show in my new component. And as you move on, since this is a custom component, it's bound to have some new properties for you as a customization point, and that's how I like to see properties. Once you go there, now you're getting to understand, since it's a circle, this is supposed to have a radius, maybe some other properties. Now I know what to expect from this, what the customization points are. And as you move to signals, this is where you get to know about the interaction. Again, I don't know anything about the implementation. It's similar to how you would read C++ code. You don't immediately jump to the implementation file. You look at the interface first. That's what matters. And for me, the properties and the signals are the interface of a QML component. There's also functions as well, which you could consider an interface, but we'll get to that later. I'm not going to mention it here. And as you go down, we get to places where these property assignments are done. And the way that I like to do the properties assignments, or what I'd like to read the property assignments as, is starting from the most essential information for a component. It could be that if you're doing a rectangle, maybe the color is most essential for you. Or if you have an image type, maybe the source size and the source is essential for you. Whatever are the properties that give you the most essential information should be the one that's available first. So that, again, as you're reading down, your mental model develops and the understanding the underlying code, the implementation for it becomes easier. And if you have less experienced people in the team who maybe just joined the code base, the team, and they're trying to understand things, this will make things a lot easier for them, especially if your code in all the components matches the way that your guidelines dictate, guidelines say that you should write the code. And then comes the implementation parts of it, the rectangle and the mouse area. But as I make my way through, again, I want to make the point that I want to build a mental model of that component. And this is very crucial for most of the decisions that I made throughout my career doing this. Okay, the first, probably the most dreaded one for Ulf as well, going to be the coding style first. By the way, if you have any comments, please feel free to raise your hands. I'll stop, and then you can raise a comment. We can talk about it. The order here is basically the order that I just described how I read QML code. I go from the most essential information down to the implementation details. And the order here, again, in your code, you probably don't have it this way. This was a pattern that emerged from the way I write the code, and I just made it more concrete by writing it down. You can adapt this to your own style. Whatever style that you see a pattern in most of your files and the others don't match, then pick one, write it down, and adjust the remaining of the code so it matches this. This becomes especially important if, for example, I work with designers, and our designers at Autodesk, in our team, write QML code as well. We go through the usual process of, they use Git, most of them on command line. They create PRs, they clone things, and they make their changes. I review their code, all that stuff. They're basically working with us like developers. And for them, this order becomes very important because once they get used to a certain style, and keep in mind that these are not developers, so with you, maybe you're used to your editor, you're using Vim or whatever, and you're able to navigate your code very fast and efficiently. But designers don't work that way. They're not that interested in it. They look at the document. If they understand it, they make their changes. It's very easy for them. So just a few examples. I'm not going to go through all of the properties, the ordering that I showed, just a quick examples here. The first one on the side that you see is the bad example, and the one on the right is the good example. The reason on the left is bad because I am starting from the things that I'm not that interested at the top. Like when I first open this file, I don't care what onCompleted is doing. It shouldn't even be there, maybe, perhaps, if you're writing good declarative code. And all the signal handlers, I'm not interested because signal handling is something, maybe it's doing something internal to me, internal to itself, that doesn't concern me. And then I get to the signal and the property type, but at the time, I already confused me, the code already confused me in the beginning by giving me all that unnecessary information. When I get to what's essential, I get confused and don't understand what's happening. And the fixed version on the right, again, it complies with that list that I had, the order that I had, starts with the root, which whatever component that you're creating, always use the ID at the top and then give it the ID root, so it's easy for you to refer to a certain thing, a property at the top, so you're not searching for IDs and where to refer them. And when it comes to, if you remember, I said the most essential information for a type should be given to me when I'm first reading that interface for a component. And in this case, for an item, something that has a geometry, I'm interested in its geometry first. Because if you imagine a button, imagine a button has multiple layers. At the bottom, it has a rectangle, a background. On top of it goes a content item. On top of it goes the label itself, some interaction. And as you're reading the component, you should be, in the order that I just described, how you built the button, you should be able to read the code in that order so that as you're going down, you mentally, in your mind, build that image of how that component is supposed to look like so that your editing later on is easier. If I read the code on the right, for example, before I get to all the other information, I already know where this is located, especially if this is, let's say, you have a window and inside of it you have some components. I already know where in that window, and maybe I already have a mental image of that window, and I can imagine that component there. As I lay things on top, I can say, okay, like this thing appears to be in here, and I can confirm that by opening my prototype. Now I want it here. So I can quickly change that information, and even without running, you can just recompile that in your mind, and then it ends up being something else. The function, or I would argue that you shouldn't have functions in your QML code, and if you do, it should be very localized in very few places. And sometimes, in at least some open source code that I saw, functions, well, if you have one line of function, I'm sure that somebody's going to change that and make it 2 lines, and somebody else will change it 5 lines, and your functions will grow or stretch or narrow down, so it'll affect the way that you read code. If you put this at the top in between, like in the example here, between the ID and some property assignments, as the code stretches here, it's confusing me because I'm not interested in what that function does. If this was a C++ file, maybe it is important because I'm doing an imperative style of programming, and if I'm looking at the implementation, I'm probably interested in what it's doing. Maybe I'm debugging some code. But for QML, QML is a visual language. So I want to do visual debugging. I'm not interested in what that function is doing. I'm interested in what it looks like, what interaction it provides me using signals or other properties. Last example is states and transitions. In my ordering, I usually put this right before the signal handlers because states and transitions usually act upon its parent, or maybe if you're using a state group or states at the top, which you shouldn't do, then it operates on maybe the top type or some other types. Since it's at the bottom, before the signal handlers, where all the customization points are done with property assignments, I can quickly understand when I look at a state, the state says, okay, the target is root and I'm changing color. I already know what root is, or maybe the ID is something else, and I already know what that type is because as I was making my way down there, I built a mental model for it. And this helps, especially for our designers, it helps for them to understand the code better, and they look at it. If you have a white monitor, you look at the state there, and you already understand what's happening, and because you know the order in your mind, your eyeball is not going around and trying to search for things. Your eyeball knows, here's the state, here's the property, and here's what I'm looking at. That information is what I'm interested in. And here's the full example. I'm going to scroll and quickly skim it. We have the property declaration at the top, and if you have a required property, that's a hard contract between you, the component, and the user of your component, so make it the most visible so that people using it don't need to run QML and then see a crash, and then later on come to your code and then update and assign a new property. They should just see it, whatever is required. It's an invariant of this type, and they should know about it. Then comes the properties, my signal declarations that define my interactions, all the other size and geometry information, position information that I'm interested in. And for some other types, like I mentioned, you may decide for image and rectangle and other types, or your custom visual type, some other information is more essential, so you put it at where it's most visible. And then comes the attached properties in here. Attached properties, they're usually bundled with their own signal handlers because you don't want to scatter, you don't want to have the same layout attached property here and then something here and then something here. Once you see an attached property, you should know that all of them are grouped together, so you're not hunting for things, you're just seeing things. You're finding them instead of searching for them. Then comes signal handlers. I made an exception for this because in my mind, I always thought this is what it's supposed to happen when my component is finally constructed, but somebody in my team brought to my attention that, hey, isn't a component an attached property as well? Why the hell is it here? And I said, you're right. So we'll change that at some point. Then comes when declaring the types, I usually go with visual children first, so I don't mix my models or cute objects to the top, because again, QML is supposed to be a visual language, so put your visual stuff first. I go from visual children to cute provided, non-visual children, and then I go to my custom children that I use for myself. And this cute object, I don't know if this is a common pattern, but I use it to hide information, whatever properties or functions that are only supposed to be used inside, I use them here. There is a ticket about introducing private properties to QML, but I don't think it's in the works yet. Ulf can correct me if it is. And then last comes the functions, JavaScript functions. One thing to note here is that you should always annotate these. And if you have some, like I have here, for example, I have the value, annotate its type, and if you have a return type, annotate that as well. You can put :void to indicate that it's supposed to return nothing as well. All right, bindings. And I think this is the most important part and the biggest pain point that I had when I first started working on my new role. Because you're coming from a different paradigm of programming, from imperative style to declarative style, you tend to still see things through the imperative spectacle. But you don't want to be doing that because QML will allow you to see things in an imperative way. But then you won't be able to have a good maintainable code in the end. So whenever you're writing QML code, make sure that it's declarative. If you can do something declaratively, then do not do it imperatively, even if it's easy. Just spend an extra 10 seconds and then do it. After a while, it'll become a habit, and doing it the imperative way is going to take you a long time. The first example here is the one, it's a very rudimentary example because I needed to fit them in the slide. You have that in onCompleted, which is supposed to, in my mind, again, is supposed to run last. It's going into that scope when that signal is emitted, and it's setting the text and the visible properties of the property of the rectangle. The problem here is, I'm assuming all of you will guess, when my index changes or my name changes, the property text and visibility will not get updated because it's an imperative assignment, and I don't have any bindings there. Whereas on the right side, all of them are bindings, and they will get updated as my information from my model changes. This was even though technically it's not a surprise, practically I recently encountered something like this where I would ask, like, who among you thinks that this is a declarative style, a binding as well? Show of hands. Is this a declarative binding or is it not? Those who say it's declarative, show of hands. Those who say, there's only one person. Those who say this is imperative, show of hands. So turns out this is actually declarative because internally that index and name become bindings to it, and the engine is, but it is able to figure out that this is what it's, and I believe bindings are probably in a way similar to the function objects maybe internally. I don't know, Ulf, you can correct me. Yes, he's nodding. So they are pretty much the same apparently. So this is actually, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but this is also a binding, which was a surprise to me. Sorry, what? Yes, so in case you didn't hear, he said it's basically the same thing with one more indirection because of that function call. And with that, I want to mention, please don't make your bindings complex. Just make them be one line as much as possible. It otherwise makes things very easy, very hard to read and understand. And forgot to mention, another tip that I have for assignments, when you're reading QML code, your eyes should mostly move from left to right instead of up and down, because I find that up and down usually promotes kind of an imperative approach where if you go left to right, at least you're in some sort of a binding land, it's easier for you. Unnecessary evaluations for bindings. This was, and to an extent still is, the bane of my existence in our source code. Not that much anymore, but it used to be that we do some sort of emission of a signal or do some evaluation in a for loop, and then with every loop, it would send out these change signals for properties if you bind to something. And this ends up being, first, you don't notice it in a desktop environment because you have lots of power, and it's very hard to realize that as long as you're doing something trivial. But in our case, it's a very data-driven application. It's a CAD application, and we have millions and millions of objects that do stuff. It becomes a performance bottleneck most of the time. So make sure that if you're doing a calculation or a lot of work, do it in an isolated environment, have the latest result, and then assign it to a property that can emit a signal. And a rule of thumb, if you're emitting a signal, you should always have an if condition there that checks if something really changed. And another rule of thumb that I have is never emit more than one signal if possible. Sometimes what I see is there's going to be, I thought he was raising his hand. There's going to be some code, maybe something is changing, and then the developer is lazy and they only add one signal that's called modified. And inside of it, it calls like 10 signals. And he only calls that because one thing changed, but it calls all of those signals. You end up in binding loops or worse. It's very hard to debug that code as well. Before I go on, how many, can you tell me, does anybody know how many different ways that you can expose a C++ object to QML? What? 4? Yes, exactly. At least I know 4. Maybe there's more, I don't know. One is the context properties. Global object, this is what that Qt object is when you do Qt.rgba or Qt.application, that's the global object. Singletons and instantiated objects. I usually prefer the last one. Context properties are deprecated, don't use them. That's why I'm not even going into details about how you would declare those things. They're not important. And one thing to note is this is also a context property. Context property doesn't necessarily mean that you use set context property in C++ type. This is also a context property because this type, rectangle, does not have a property called border width. No, but it's looking itself up from the other context, right? That's why I consider it a context property, so it's wrong. Yeah. Yes. But I've seen some cases where a property, I guess it works for IDs. If you have an ID in one place and use it in some other, and if it happens that in that context, hierarchy of context, there's an ID that you're looking for, it'll just work. Okay. All right, so it's not a context property, but still don't do it. That's what he said as a summary. All right, this part is going to be controversial. I know at least there was some discussion on GitHub, and there was a training here on the first day. There was also talked about it, but in my opinion, singletons are for API access only. If you're doing, you have some common operations like calculating some sort of geometry or getting some screen geometry information, or in this case, confirming the exit if you would like to show up a message box and then the result is canceled, so you don't want to close the window. This is when I usually want to do it. The only exception to that is themes. For that, I usually use, well, I guess you can only use, well, there's a way you can use instantiated objects as well, but it gets complicated. So for themes, I use singletons, but for all other stuff, I usually don't use singleton, except for common API access. And my reasoning for this is that, and also because we have designers working in the team, singletons, in my opinion, are as good as global objects. Doesn't matter when or how they're created, and it's one more thing that you need to worry about. In my opinion, if you're looking at a code, especially QML code, you should only be concerned about that block of code. And if you're a component, then an individual file, then you should only be concerned about that file, not anything else. If you're seeing a singleton, that it just puts one more question mark in my mind, like, how does this affect my work here? And I don't like that. But it's a personal taste, nothing that technical about it. It's up to you. And if you prefer using singletons for more than API access, I suggest at least don't use them in individual components so that you don't create an additional dependency for that component, because you want your components to be reusable and extensible as much as possible. If the more dependencies that you introduce for your component, the less flexible and reusable it is. At least for stuff that you can do is at least introduce another property at the top so that somebody else sets that property from a singleton. Doesn't matter as far as that component is concerned. And for this cases, the case that I just mentioned, that's why I say I prefer instantiated types over singletons, because in my opinion, with instantiated types, it gives me one more customization point where, in this case, if I have selected colors and I put that selected colors there, I'm only bound to that singleton type. If I want to test my component with some other set of colors, maybe some other model that I dynamically load from the disk from a JSON file because I'm testing things, why not? I won't be able to do that with a singleton, because maybe I want to compare two objects, two components. I won't be able to do that. But with instantiated types, or at least using a property at the top for it, I'm given more freedom for it. I can prototype easily, and if you set up your architecture, QML application architecture correctly, you can do things like don't even run the background, the core side of things. Just run your front end, and then put in mock data load it from a JSON file, and your application in the background, like you don't have your OpenGL context or engine, whatever else is you're running. It's not there. It's just a skeleton app that somebody's evaluating because of visual QA purposes. The other thing when you're exposing, watch out for object ownership rules, I should say, but you shouldn't need to watch out for these things. I don't think you should be worried about this. If you're exposing something to QML side, I would say preferably don't expose them for QML types, Q objects directly. Either use a property for it or don't do it at all. Maybe make it a property change so that the C++ type can react to that change and then do things on its own. But if you're exposing things, at least make sure that you expose them through the Q property declaration there. Otherwise, if your type doesn't have a parent, QML engine will take ownership, and then bad things are going to happen. You can find this presentation online, and there's a good write-up about this, an article from an actual real-life example of an embedded application running into a similar bug and a crash eventually. Memory, like I mentioned, and like most of us here, I'm not an embedded developer, so I don't care that much about this sort of stuff. At least at first. It's not I do the right things, we try to do the right things by default, but sometimes if we're going to take a quick shortcut to accomplish something faster, development time, we'll do that. If you have some experience there, please go to the GitHub page, clone the repository, add your findings there, create a PR, and then we can discuss and update the document. So I'm sure that the stuff that you experience in the embedded world at some point is going to be relevant to us when we're working on the extremes of millions and millions of data, even in a high performance hardware. Signals, and again, I found that this is one of the things that developers get wrong. Well, imperative developers get wrong when they're first starting QML development. They treat signals as functions. And this is a very bad idea, not because things are not going to work, but because your eyes or your documents are going to go like this. You'll hunt for information again. The purpose is to find information, not search for it. You shouldn't be hunting it. And using signals as functions or using signals excessively, connecting one signal to the other, especially in QML side, makes things harder for you. So when you're declaring functions or signals, stick to Qt already does this in all the signals that I know of. Use the imperative form for functions and a passive form for the signals. Because functions do something, but signals tell you that something changed or something happened. There's multiple ways of connecting to a signal in the QML side. And for someone who had just started using QML, this may look like an appealing thing because in C++ side, you use QObject connect to connect the signals, and you figure, why not do it here? Because nobody's stopping you, and you don't have a guideline until now. So you start using this, and because connect itself, it's not like the C++ version. Ulf, correct me if I'm wrong. It's not like the C++ version where if you have the receiver and the sender and the receiver, if one of them die, then the connection gets disconnected. But in the QML side, as long as the connection is there, it's not disconnected, and the component is still alive, then it'll still be there, or the connection will still be there. Correct me. Yes, exactly. In this case, as long as the sender is alive, yes, the connection will still be alive. And with this example, you'll run into, let me see if I have the, whoops, I should have launched it early. But the code is there for you to try. What is going to happen in this case is you're going to run the application. A list view is going to display these buttons. And as you resize the windows, because of that cache buffer to prove a point, not that you would normally do it, the buttons will get destroyed, but the connections that you create in there are not going to get destroyed. So when you click the button, as you scroll, maybe you have lots of items there, you click a button and it says null item, access to a null item, or the property doesn't exist. And then you're going to be like, why is this happening? I know that my property here, and then it's going to take a while for you to debug this. An alternative to that would be not using the connect. So don't use it, and I'll show you. instead, what you can do is use a connection type for these purposes. At least when this connections and its parent is destroyed, you'll be sure that the signal handle is also destroyed, and you won't run into cases like this. All right. Another problem that I see with the signal, the use of the signal as a function approach, is sometimes in reusable components. Let's read this code. So in here, I have the color picker, and underneath that, I'm using that color picker. But notice that I have a color picked signal, but I don't have a color property here. Sorry, the rectangle has a color property, but this color picked has a picked color property. And in here, whenever the color dialog gives me the new color, I'm only emitting that signal and saying, this is my new color now. And the user of that component is changing the color so that the representation changes. And then it's also doing some other stuff with that new color. Maybe it's saying color changed. The problem with that approach is color picker is no longer reusable. You take this, you use this in some other place, and you forgot to, maybe you bind directly to the color, and then all of a sudden your color component is not working, and then you're wondering why. Because you don't look into other places where that component is being used, because you think if it's there, it's working, but it's not. Because the function, the signal is being treated like a function, and it changes things that it's not supposed to change. And the correct approach for this would be change the color internally. It already has a color changed property, so you wouldn't even need this. But if you need sometimes, since it's the dialog, maybe you need an accepted or closed or closing signals, then you can add those. But everything that a component needs to do should do it itself without you having to interact with it from outside. As far as I understand, you're saying that use the function syntax, the arrow syntax for signal handles, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will mention this in the next slides. He's saying that the parameter for this color picked, as far as, and if I'm not misunderstanding you, for the on-color picked signal, you should have the picked color declared here. That's what you said, right? This? Yeah, it already has a type here. Okay, I was right, just so you know. Not all wrong. All right. And for signals and functions, I found that the rule of thumb is when communicating up, use signals. When communicating down, use functions. States and transitions. This is just a short one. We've run into cases like this where states are implemented as QQML list property in the background. And with QQML list properties, you'd have to explicitly reset them, because if you have a component here, do I need to scroll down? No, awesome. If you have your component here that uses the top level states, and somebody else wants to change something with states as well, because they can and they should, if they do this, then this state is not replaced. This state is not entirely replaced by the ones that I declare here. What happens is this additional state is added to the list of states that I already have. So when you run this code, you will press and then the color change, but you want something else happening here, and that won't take effect. There's a pragma for it? I'm not familiar with that. So there is apparently a way to avoid this problem. I'm going to need to learn more in depth and then write this down for everybody else to see. And just before I go, the solution to this, what we usually do if we have lots of states, we use state groups inside the component itself, or maybe sometimes what people do, you declare states at the top level, but those states are only actually changing the properties of some children. In those cases, you don't even need to declare states there, just put those states in the component, in the type that's changing itself. Or you can use state groups for that purpose. Visual items. This is also one of the biggest problems that we had, especially working with designers. One size does not fit all if you want good reusable user interface and components. And it's very important to understand these concepts, especially if you're doing lots and lots and lots of component design, and we have many of those. Your code is going to be hard to understand. Your UI is not going to look correct because you use one component in one window when you happen to set an explicit size to it, or you have an anchor that sets its size. And in some other case, you only want a column without explicit sizes, and then your component is not there. And then you're scratching your head. Why is it not there? And no one is going to help you unless you know these rules. Because I don't think, maybe with some tools, maybe something like Gamma Ray could tell you, because you would see that in the properties would be exposed to you in Gamma Ray, and then you could see, this has a size of 0. Or what you do, add the debugging rectangle with just transparent rectangle with maybe red borders, and then you'll see, I see some sort of red here, but it's not showing properly. So in order to save yourself that problem, understand implicit, explicit, content size. These are all different things. And sometimes content size mean different things depending on the type that you're using. For list view and flickable, it means something different. Actually, they mean the same thing, but not the same thing as in a button, for example. Implicit size is the space that the component itself says it should occupy unless an external force is being forced upon it. If nobody else dictates what my size should be, the component says, I'm supposed to look this way. Because I'm a checkbox, I have a label, I have a rectangle indicator, and the minimum size that I need for this is the minimum size that I put for my rectangle, and whatever the content size from a label is. So if my label is hello world, then it'll look this big, and if it's something bigger than the checkbox, then its root size will extend, so that you'll be sure that whatever information that you give to that component, it'll always represent it properly. And this is I don't think you could have one rule that applies to all of the components. Sometimes your component will say, hey, my implicit size is going to be whatever my content is, in the case of checkbox, my indicator, and then my label. But for some other component, maybe you'll say, I know my use cases, and I only want this much size because I know how to represent myself in different cases, and it'll change its implicit size based on that. But you should always have implicit sizes for your reusable components. And in my experience, you shouldn't use explicit size within that component for the top type, at least. Always put implicit size. Don't use anchors there, never. And never use width and height because they will get overwritten by something else. And implicit size is it's a good sane default for users of a component to roll back to. Because if they put them, maybe you're using some sort of dynamic drag and drop, and once you drop it from one layout to the other, it changes its size, and then you're coming back to it. We have this in our docking implementation, for example. We dock our window, but once we come back, we want to be able to go back to the previous size. How do you keep that information? You don't want to add new properties for every single thing that you want to remember, because there's already principles for that in place. Use implicit size, so it's a sane default to go back to. Explicit size is that width and height assignment, really, and you shouldn't need to set that to use a component. You should use that whenever you'd like, but you shouldn't have to do it. Content size, this is for flickable and list view. I'm sure a few other views as well. I can't remember all of them right now, but it determines, it has a certain, let's say, it'll have this size for itself. This will be its explicit size, but internally, it's going to represent some other things here and there, and then it'll overflow down below, something like Flickable or Scroll View. And the content size is this here, but its explicit size is smaller than that. And if you want proper scrolling and flicking behavior, you will need to set this content size for it to work properly. Padding, margin, and inset is also the most difficult thing that I had to teach. Especially for designers, it's very hard to understand for them. It only has one size. Why do they need to worry about anything else? But if you want, again, good reusable components, understanding these things really make a difference. Padding and insets are internal properties of a component. You don't want those, usually, you don't want those being set from outside. And the size of a component should be sort of determined by its padding, so that whenever you change the explicit size, your component still looks the same. Because when you have a button, you want the spaces in between your button, let's say this is my text here, you want this spacing, this section here, to be the same, no matter what the size of that component is, because you're interested in proportions. You're not interested in explicit sizes. You never say, my content size is 10 pixels. And it's going to be 10 pixels, even though this red area here is like 100 pixels. That doesn't work. It's not going to look good on your UI. So you want that proportional, relational size to it. So if somebody changes from being 100 pixels to 200 pixels, everything inside of it will stretch beautifully, and you'll still have a good-looking component. At least it'll look like as it should, as if it was 100 pixels or 50 pixels. The last thing is inset. This is an interesting one that I only have one use case for, but it's used in the Qt Quick Controls implementation. It just determines the space. It's basically padding for the background. It determines the space between the background. Let's say this is the background. This is the edge of my component. If the inset is 0, the background edge will also be right at where the external edge is. If you set it to 100, then this will have some space in between, or if you had it to some other value, it can stretch as well. It changes. This is useful for touch applications where you want the visual, your visual to be 100 by 100, but your touch environment to be maybe 150 by 150. Inset is useful for those cases. All right. I'm running out of time, so I will skip these. Before I skip to the JavaScript side, this one section from that infamous paper, Go to Statements Considered Harmful, from that paper, for some reason, this section always stuck with me. It says, our intellectual powers are rather geared to master static relations instead of dynamic, growing over time kind of relations. And when I'm writing, mostly for C++ code as well, but especially for QML code, I usually strive for static relationships. And static relationships are best formed with declarative style, because you declare the binding here, and that relationship is created there. And it's not going to change. Nobody's going to change that relationship status to being single again. It's always going to be married there. And it's going to be easy for me to reason with the properties, reason with the signal handlers. That's why connections, I discourage connections object unless you absolutely have to. Handle your signals right where they are. For some cases you may need it, but using them, establishing that relationship right in place is usually much better. So if you strive for static relationships instead of these dynamic relationships with using signals as functions or connecting one signal to another signal, and then you're hunting for information, that makes for bad code and hard to maintain code. Last thing is JavaScript. This is, I think, whenever you hear people talk about QML and JavaScript, they'll usually say, no, don't use JavaScript, which I agree with. But sometimes you will end up using it for small cases, like I was talking to Thomas today and Ulf, they were saying, oh, for focus management, you can use that. It's a simple use case. You're not moving the world in there. It's just a few things here, little interactions that you want to add. And for those cases, I usually stick to, again, Ulf, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the latest supported ECMAScript version is 8, I think, or 7?
No? Yeah.
The newer ECMAScript versions are not completely supported in QML. We've picked a few things from later ECMAScript standards, like knowledge coalescing and optional chaining and the URL objects, but we haven't upgraded to a later standard. The last one we support is ECMAScript 6, I think.
So it's good to take advantage of those new features, especially for JavaScript functions. If they're returning something, annotate your functions. Excuse me. Annotate your functions. And for some cases, which with this cute binding expression here, I discourage. Go ahead.
The function annotations are not JavaScript. That's a feature we've kind of adapted from TypeScript, and they are not available in JavaScript files. So any .js file, you cannot annotate your functions.
I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Yeah, only in .qml files.
Okay. I usually, especially for signal handlers, I usually use the arrow syntax for these functions, and inside of it you can declare whatever. If the signal in the previous example that I showed, color picked, has a signal property called, signal argument called picked color, what you can do is use this arrow function syntax, assign that function to that signal handler, and then include that picked color property, argument inside the braces here, so that you know what your signal handler is dealing with. And for other cases, small cases here and there, it's really nitpicky area here, but use const whenever you can. Instead of using var, use let, because it has proper scoping support. And that's pretty much it. We have a lot of QML code and relatively small functions, JavaScript code, but I don't remember a case where we've used anything more than this. And I don't think you would need anything more than this. Although you could do more, because most of those JavaScript features are supported like prototypes. You can add functions to existing, like a number type or the map type and stuff like that. Was this the thing that you were mentioning, Ulf?
Yes.
Yes, so you should do this, so that you know what I guess this also goes into the context property, unqualified access land, right?
Yes, if we can't see the arguments you're using, then it does interesting things in the engine that we can't do at compile time.
Yeah. And QML compiler is a big thing now, so whatever you're doing, always static typing. Write QML code like you're writing C++ code, as far as type system is concerned. Message received. All right. What's next? I've been kind of neglecting, to be honest, the coding guideline, but throughout the 3 years that I've worked at Alias Autodesk, we've written a lot of QML code. I work daily with designers, so sometimes I put things here that may not make sense for a developer, but it makes lots of sense for designers because it makes them easier to understand the code. And for the future, I want to remove some of the old things that I did. I don't know if you checked the document. Ulf, you said you did. I did remove some of the stuff, and instead of removing the content, I usually just add the strike-through effect and say, here's my reasoning for adding it in the first place. This is why I'm removing it, but keeping it for historical reasons so that I know the progression of that knowledge. And I want to have an architecture section for QML coding guidelines. I think that's a big thing. It's very tempting to inject a lot of C++ types into your stuff with context properties, or not have proper distinction between your business logic and the QML code. And it's good to share that. In our case, we've remember when I said you could be using instantiated types to add some mock data, load a JSON file into your instantiated types and whatnot to do prototyping. The way that we set up our new architecture is just like that. We have 5 million lines of code in the background, but we could not run any of that, none of the initialization code, run just a skeleton and have our designers or users evaluate the UI without running into some other issues or noticing some unrelated stuff in there. And this kind of information comes with experience. You can't just, I can't just sit one day and say, okay, how am I supposed to do this architecture, and then say, Eureka, I'll do this. It's impossible. And it'd be great to hear about your experiences, especially in the embedded world. I'm sure most people will appreciate that more, since never been there, but I'm assuming it's a closed off environment there. You can't share much, I'm assuming, but it would be good to have this information available to everybody. And there's one lie in all the things I said, and Ulf didn't correct me, and that is this guidelines is community-driven. I lied. It's not community-driven at all. I wrote all of it, unfortunately. I received some feedback from Mitch Curtis, shout out to him. I appreciated his feedback. Some people from some ex-Qt developers, the Qt company employees, I appreciate that as well. And there are about 3-4 issues. Some people brought up something, and we had a good constructive conversation there, and I adjusted the content based on that. I encourage you, please go to GitHub, and the good thing about this, the barrier to GitHub is very easy. You don't need to install Gerrit and all that stuff to, hold on, hold on. You don't need to install a lot of stuff to contribute to this. Everybody uses it. Go in, update things, we can discuss it. Worst case, clone it, make it a live document for your own organization. I do this as well. I basically maintain 2 different ones. One that is public here, one that is internal to Autodesk. You can do the same. That way we can keep it alive and share the knowledge. Ulf?
Yeah, like in this place, I would like to remind you that the Qt documentation is open source. So you can just clone Qt Declarative, and there is a directory source QML source doc or something, and there's all the documentation for QML. And I would really appreciate much of the stuff to be part of the official documentation. So I'm definitely taking patches there, and I would I would be very happy to review any changes coming in this way.
That'd be awesome.
There are some things that are kind of, in my views, less important but very controversial. That's
we'll keep that in here. Move the useful stuff there. How about that?
Yeah, like in particular the ordering of various elements in QML files. You have a good reasoning for doing it the way you show here. But my experience is everybody does it differently, and everybody has their own reasoning and why they want to have certain kinds of properties on top of other properties.
Yeah.
And you can bike shadow that like for ages. So I would not put that into the official documentation.
Although that is already indeed in the official documentation.
Yeah, well, but it contradicts the stuff that you say here. So
Yeah.
there we have it.
I know, that's why it's garbage.
On the other hand, a big part of what is not in your presentation right now is the integration, the meat of the C++ integration, like how do I register types? And that's a very important thing for compilation to C++, because in order to analyze your QML documents, we need to know what types you're using and what properties those types have and what functions and so on. And so what should be stressed is to use the proper build system API to announce your QML modules, in particular Qt.QML module in CMake, and to use the declarative registration with QML element macro in your headers to announce, okay, this is a type exposed to QML.
Yeah.
So,
and that's the kind of stuff. There's a lot more in the documentation, in the GitHub repository that I didn't include here, otherwise it would take me 3-4 hours at least. But please go there, read the document. There's already stuff missing from most of the Qt 6 features, or some of the new QML features are missing. I didn't have time to get to that yet. It would be great to have your help. And with that, I want to end it in case for questions, but we have 1 minute or,
All right.
or more. I don't know.
Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure how much time we have, but Tobias, just 2 minutes. Okay. Yeah. So we have 2 minutes for questions. Are there any? Tobias, right behind you.
Concerning the singleton or instantiated types, what's your preferred way to expose heavyweight models to QML? Like models written in C++.
Heavyweight models, like you mean millions of objects models?
Like models which I cannot just instantiate from QML, and they're not static. They're data changes driven by some backend. And
well, I always say that just because it's an instantiated type in this QML world doesn't mean that it has to be It has to be an instantiated type in the C++ world as well. The reason, like I said, that I try not to expose singletons is because of that mental switch. But what you can do is, we have this in our source code. You have your instantiated type in QML, and then internally, that fetches that information from whatever singleton that you have. You can even provide like maybe enums for customization points, where you can say, okay, now load me this or load me that, or give me some mock data, whichever, and you can easily do that. And if you want if you want the same information in multiple places, then all of them will already have it. But if you want some more control or customization over what you prefer here, then you can even mix that model with some filter proxy model that you have or some other filtering mechanisms to customize that to your needs, instead of having one single source of truth where everything stays the same. And once you make a change here, it goes to other places as well. You can do that. I'm not saying there's no technical reason for it. I think it's more of a maintainability and reusability standpoint.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your question.
Okay, we're out of time, but maybe if you keep yourself. Yeah,
Well, I'll
fine.
be here today and tomorrow, so if you have anything, we can discuss.
All right. Thanks very much again,
Thank you.
Furkan.